Environment and Resources Scrutiny Committee meeting, and welcome to those viewing on the live stream this meeting tonight. Okay, item 1 then is the apologies for absence. Please, David.
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Councillors Brown, Moyo and Skibstead this evening, and Councillors Fenner, Sainsbury and Joseph are in attendance as subs. Thank
you very much. Councillor Fenner, Sainsbury and Joseph, thank you very much for filling in. It's much appreciated. Item 2 is declarations of interest and whip-in declarations. No, none of those, thank you. Item 3 then relates to the minutes of the meetings held on firstly the 22nd of February 2021, which is a joint meeting of the scrutiny committees. That's pages 3 to 26 in your packs. We'll do these one at a time. Anybody got anything on those at all, or are they a true record? Are we agreed? So that's the first one. Next one, 3.2, relates to the meeting on the 10th of March 21, and again was this Growth, Environment and Resources Scrutiny Committee, pages 27 to 32. True account for those that were here? Anything else you want to bring up? No? Okay. The next one is the meeting on the 23rd of March 2021, which is the extraordinary meeting of the Growth, Environment and Resources Scrutiny Committee, pages 33 to 36 in your packs. For those that were here, are they a true account? All agreed? Good, thank you very much. Right, we'll move on then to item 4, which is calling of any Cabinet member or key officer's decision. David?
No requests for call in this evening, Chair.
Thank you. Item 5 then is to appoint the co-opted members, pages 37 to 40 in your packs. David, please.
Thank you, Chair. So at Peterborough City Council, every scrutiny committee can appoint up to 4 independent non-voting co-opted members, one of which must be a parish councillor, and the Think Community Service area have gone out to all the parishes to seek nominations for this position, and Michael Samways has kindly put himself forward to be a co-opted member, so the committee are asked to consider his appointment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Anybody got anything particular they want to add on that, or can we just invite Michael in as a member? All happy? Okay. Parish Councillor Michael Samways, please join us. You've got one there for you. Welcome. Okay. Next one then is item 6. This is pages 41 to 172 in your packs, and is to inform the strategic direction in response to Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Commissions on Climate's initial report. Now, presenting officers, I've got Hannah Swinburne, Charlotte Palmer as presenting officers, and then also guests and councillors. We've got Councillor Nigel Simons, who's the Cabinet Member for Waste, Street, Scene and Environmental, Adrian Cannard, the Strategic Planning Manager, Combined Authority, and also 2 commissioners, Lynn Sullivan and Greg Archer, who are joining us online, and Steve Cox, who is also joining us online. So, who's actually going to present the report? Is it going to be you? Councillor Simons then, please. Thank you.
Yeah, just like to make a short statement. Good evening, everybody. Peterborough City Council has declared a climate emergency, and in doing so, we committed to reducing our emissions to net zero by 2030. We also committed to helping our city reduce its carbon emissions to net zero by 2030. Climate change is being recognised as an increasingly important issue across the region. The Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority established an independent commission, Climate, and in March of this year they released an initial report. This report sets out bold ambitions for the county and a number of recommendations to lower emissions. Peterborough becoming a carbon neutral city is a significant challenge, one of which we require effort in many, if not all, areas. In order to help decide what actions and policies we should prioritise, I would like to ask this scrutiny committee for its thoughts on the initial recommendations set out in the report and invite the committee to recommend areas of priority to the Climate Change Working Group. Your views, alongside the views of our residents, businesses, community groups and other key stakeholders, will be used to help shape our city-wide carbon management action plan, which will be produced later this year. We are joined this evening by Officers Charlotte Palmer, Council's Group Manager for Highways and Transport, Hannah Swinburne, our Principal Climate Change Officer. In addition, Adrian Connard, Strategic Planning Manager at Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority, has kindly joined us in person this evening, which we are very grateful. We are also joined virtually by Lynn Sullivan, Homes Alliance Board member of Passive Trust and Active Building Centre. She was RIBA's Ambassador on Climate Change, representing RIBA at COP21 in Paris and chairing their Substantial Futures Group 2014 to 2017. Lynn has authored and chaired a number of policy review and research projects on building performance and substantiality for UK governments and others, including a low-carbon building standards strategy for Scotland. We are also joined by Greg Archer. Greg is the UK Director of International Environment Organisation, Transport and Environment. He is also Chair of the environmental organisation ECOS and runs a consultancy. He has over 25 years' experience researching and developing solutions to environmental impacts of transport. Since 2019, Greg has run the UK office T&E, working to secure 2030 ban on sales of all new conventional cars. From 2012, he was based in Brussels and T&E's vehicle director, successfully campaigning for strong car CO2 regulations that have stimulated the shift to electric cars. At this point, I would like to hand over to Adrian, who will introduce Commissioner's report and the current status of this work within the Combined Authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and good evening to the committee. Just a few words from me to introduce the work of the Commission, and then, as we've heard, we have two commissioners who have led on very important aspects of the Commission's work on buildings and transport. So as a bit of background, the Combined Authority set up the Independent Commission to give us that authoritative evidence base about climate change affecting Cambridgeshire and Peterborough and the sorts of actions that we ought to be taking. The Commission decided to split their work into two parts. So the first report concentrated on transport, buildings, energy and the peat issue. And the second piece of work, which is still ongoing, is looking in more detail at business, waste, adapting to climate change that is already upon us, and also how to achieve our response in the fairest manner, reflecting that in many cases the impacts of climate change will impact on different residents in different ways, and in fact the Commission found that in some cases the most vulnerable to climate change were also those that were least able in terms of resources to take the immediate action that they might need to do. So that's a real topic that's being picked up. The Commission came up with 31 recommendations. Most of those were directed at the Combined Authority. There were a handful of recommendations where there were calls for government action to change, particularly on building standards, which are determined nationally. And a number of the recommendations also would impact on the Council's work. And we have taken that through the board and done an initial response, but we'll be working very closely with yourselves and your officers to implement those recommendations as we go forward. If I could just then hand over to our two commissioners that we have to give just a few words on the key aspects that came out under their topics. I don't know if Lynn would like to go first on the sort of buildings topic.
Thank you, Adrian. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting us. Yes, I chaired the buildings task group under the chair of Baroness Brown and for the Commission. And, well, many aspects, but the key ones, I guess, are those emerging really amongst progressive authorities across the country, that really one needs a local plan, a heat and energy plan, particularly for domestic buildings, which are such a large share. I think it's nearly a quarter of the combined authorities' total emissions. So local energy planning, we made a recommendation that should happen. There is a large number, I think 4,000 homes a year planned for the combined authority, new build. And it's particularly in those areas of growth where the Climate Change Committee has recommended a future home standard which is sufficient to enable zero emissions heating. In other words, very well insulated, highly energy efficient buildings. They have recommended that be brought forward from what government's announced, which is 2025 to 2023, and we reflected that ambition in our recommendations because of the number of new build homes proposed for the combined authority, and those standards are well enough known and are really zero carbon ready. So it's slightly higher energy efficiency standards, but in anticipation of the decarbonisation of the electric grid. On our existing homes, which although across the region are marginally better than the national average, there's a lot of work being done on kind of profiling both the condition and the energy performance of our existing buildings, which, as I say, is a big black hole in our carbon emissions. And what we're proposing is that the local authority should set about profiling existing buildings with a planning to enable, again, the low carbon heat to work in our existing homes, which means basically an energy efficiency program, utilising whatever programs are available, which we believe will be forthcoming as a follow-up to the Green Homes Grant, which, as we know, has been a bit of a failure. But we've made firm recommendations for both existing buildings as well as the new build. So I think that probably is it in a nutshell, Adrian. Thank you. But any questions, please throw them up.
Okay. We'll go to questions if it's okay when everybody's spoken, and we'll go around the room if that's okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to Greg now, yes?
Well, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for asking me. I chaired the transport subgroup, and what we found within that group was really that transport emissions, and particularly surface transport emissions, are the biggest source of CO2 in the CPCA region. In fact, they account for 44% of all of the CO2 emissions in the region, and that's significantly higher than the national average, which is 37% overall. We also found that those emissions are rising much more quickly than they are in the rest of the UK as a result largely of more car use and larger vehicles. So emissions are 12% above their levels in 2012. The UK average is for a 4% increase overall. Now, I think we need to recognise that if we're going to achieve our climate goals, surface transport will need to be entirely or virtually entirely decarbonised by 2050. And that means we have to have a very significant shift to zero emission vehicles, and that's most likely to mean, certainly in the part of passenger cars and taxis and most urban buses, a shift to battery electric vehicles. But in order to do that, we will need a much stronger charging infrastructure to be provided to local residents, particularly to local residents who do not have off-street parking. The vast majority of people who have off-street parking will charge at their homes and not make great use of the public charging network except on long trips. But for those people parking off street, this is absolutely crucial. But we also need to recognise that alongside that shift to electric vehicles, we also have to have a transition away from car use. And to that end, some of the key things which we need to be particularly focused on are things around the new developments, particularly the large number of additional new settlements which are coming up around the region. We really do need those to be properly attached and connected to the public transport network, and also to have very strong connections with cycleways and so forth. And one of the key things to remember with this transition to active travel, walking, cycling and public transport is the enormous co-benefits which come with that in terms of health, in terms of accessibility and so forth. Now, in relation to our specific recommendations, one of the key things that we have called upon the Combined Authority and the individual councils to do is to develop a plan for the rollout of charging infrastructure within their local areas, to make sure that the big increase which we expect to see in electric vehicles really can be delivered in their local areas. This month, over 10% of the new cars being sold were battery electric vehicles in the UK. We expect those figures to rise to more than a quarter of new cars sold by 2025. So we really need to be getting on with this now. I think the second thing to recognise is that it's not just about cars, it's also about converting other types of vehicles. So we really need all buses, all taxis operated within the CPCA regions to be zero emission by 2030. And that means starting to procure those vehicles now, and particularly on subsidised routes. We really think you should be trying to operate those with zero emission buses by 2025 wherever possible, so that you've got a complete shift over by 2030. Similarly, in terms of taxis, licensed taxis, around a third of those could be zero emission by 2025. And the council's own fleet really needs to start transitioning over to zero emission vehicles too. And finally, there's an awful lot that can be done to try to actually reduce car use overall. I mentioned about major new developments being connected, but I think there's opportunities for the council to start developing innovative on-demand buses to start to connect with outlying villages and bring those into the public transport system, to work with major employers in terms of reducing commuting, encouraging lift shares and things of that sort, and opportunities to explore much more the provision of cycling infrastructure and so forth. So there is a huge range of opportunities which are out there for both public transport and private transport. And finally, there's a lot of opportunity to do more with freight through the development of things like freight consolidation centres and managing home deliveries in a more effective way than is being done at the present time. So huge opportunities for saving, but I'm happy to take questions on anything you may ask.
Thank you very much, Greg. Is anybody else going to be speaking on this, or can we go to questions? Nobody else? Okay. As I've already said to committee before, if you could sort of like point us to the page, if you know the page you're going to ask a question on, it would be useful for us to follow you. But basically, we'll start from who would like to ask a question, please. Councillor Joseph.
Page 53. There's a mention of 700 million per annum in the Combined Authority area. Can I ask how much of that is attributed to Peterborough? Obviously, some of that we're hoping to come from business investment, but how much is Peterborough City Council being asked to fund out of that? And what plans have we got in place to find that money, considering our current precarious situation? Thank you.
Okay. Who's going to answer that one?
So if I'll answer that. As part of the work we had on the evidence base, we got the University of Leeds to cost up the interventions, as you've said, the £700 million per year. Now, that's not necessarily public sector. That covers people who are upgrading their homes, you know, as part of it. We haven't yet broken that down by individual authority, and we're in conversations with them as one of the things that we could take forward on that. Obviously, the interventions that are there, we want to now look at individually and see where the sources of finances are, and we will certainly be looking at what the Combined Authority can do, but also in terms of attracting central government funding. And there are a number of ongoing grant programmes that we are currently tapping into. So we've looked at the zero emission buses competition which is going on, but also I know your authorities taking advantage of the green homes grants around retrofitting for heating. So there are opportunities, but we don't have an individual cost per area, and we recognise that in many cases this will be about attracting new investment. One of the things that the Commission did find is that there's quite an appetite for the private sector to invest in green measures on the basis that they can both make a return, but also increasingly consumers are demanding that they demonstrate green credentials. So there is a growing market to attract private finance into this.
Okay. Yes, I have a supplementary.
Obviously, you said you're looking into breaking it down. Do you have a date on when that breakdown is likely to be able to be brought before the committee?
We're just in conversations with the University of Leeds as to whether it can be done, and they've just indicated that it's something that can be done. I don't anticipate that will take very long. They have their methodology and all the data from us to break that down. So in conversation with your officers, we'll look to bring it forward as soon as we can. I'm not sure when your next appropriate meeting is, but it's not a long process once we get that underway.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Joseph. Councillor Day.
Hello, thank you for this report. I welcome the words at the beginning of it when it talks about these actions being urgent and critical, because if we're on the current path at the moment, we'll be warming up to 4 degrees Celsius, and that pretty much means game over. So I do really welcome this urgent and critical report. Just wanted to ask about the decarbonisation of heat in buildings on page 14, and you alluded to that, Lynn, that the Green Homes Grant Scheme has been scrapped, which was quite a significant pot of funding for decarbonising buildings. I wonder how we would envisage funding this. Does the CPCA have an allocated pot of funding, and if not, how will we be able to fund this decarbonisation of heat in buildings? And also on page 14, it talks about all new buildings being net zero carbon by 2023. What standards are we looking towards? Is it passive house or equivalent, and how can we implement that, particularly in Peterborough, and how can we ensure that's reflected in our local plan?
Yes, you're right. We are awaiting a major policy announcement nationally, the Heat in Buildings strategy, which we're all assuming will kind of reconfigure government's kind of fiscal and direct grants potential for decarbonising existing buildings. So it's kind of watch this space. But some of the residual amounts that weren't spent under the Green Homes Grant have gone into the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund and the local authority tranches. So there's certainly more potential there to act as pilots for large-scale decarbonisation. Just to come back to Adrian's point about match funding, there are some very interesting examples that actually were government-sponsored pilots, which we believe could help implement the recommendations. Are that local supply chain pilots have worked with local businesses, because obviously one of the huge co-benefits of the upgrading existing building stock is the skills potential and indeed the revenue to local business potential. And these pilots have shown that there is pent-up demand in many areas and that really what's needed is a decent plan to work to for decarbonisation, and it's that first planning bit that we've really emphasised as a key action for the combined authorities to really help both public landlords and private owners to understand where they need to go with their properties to decarbonise, and then we believe the demand is there, and much of the cost could be borne by them and by local businesses upskilling and seeing the potential financial rewards from that. So it's hopefully a win-win situation once you're on the right path to go, to go where we need to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Wiggin.
Thank you, Chair. In the executive summary, page 9, which is page 54 in the agenda pack, emphasises that local government and the CPCA has a key role to play. One of our key levers as a local authority is our local plan. However, our local plan was approved before we declared a climate emergency. Are the different local authorities' plans something the Commission have looked at in detail, and do you think, or does the Commission and the officers and councillors think that our local plan in Peterborough is fit for purpose in the context of a climate emergency?
I'll go at that one if you
Yeah,
don't mind. I don't think it's for me to judge your local plan. Obviously, they are all produced at the time in line with relevant policy. I think what the Commission found was, firstly, and answering the previous question as well, some of the building regulation changes are more crucial and are more difficult to get into local plan policy. It's actually building regulations which government sets. They did consult on a future homes standard, and one of the actions that the Combined Authority will be taking up will be pressing government to bring forward updates, because it effectively sets a level playing field for the development industry, and therefore you won't have a situation where development might not take place in one authority area because it has higher standards for that. So that was our sort of key finding around that. Obviously, planning policy does evolve, and local plans do come up for review. Certainly, other authorities are in the middle of their current reviews and have done a lot of work looking at how they adapt to climate change, and that would be a thing that your planners would advise, I guess, in terms of how far you need to go in any future revision.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. Yeah, Councillor Burbidge.
Thank you. I'm guessing mine's going to be for Greg regarding the electrical vehicle charging points. I was just wondering whether there was a plan to have those, how they were going to be installed. I'm thinking particularly in the housing estates where vehicles aren't necessarily parked outside the house.
There's no specific details given in the report, but from other work that I've done, what's often misunderstood is that modern electric cars, with the range which they have, will not need charging every day. In fact, the average car in the UK will only need a 50% charge once a week. And that means we don't need to have charging points outside every home or along every road where cars are parked. In fact, it makes far more sense to have a good allocation of charging points in supermarket car parks, in retail car parks, in city centres, and then a collection of rapid chargers where people can go and charge in 20 to 30 minutes, along with some curbside charging where there's a heavy density of electric vehicles. So in effect, what we're saying is that the council does not need to be trying to deploy thousands or tens of thousands of charge points along every road. They need to think more strategically about how many cars, electric cars they've got in their area, where those are being located, and particularly where they're parked on the road rather than in people's driveways, and then think about where in that local area are people taking their car and it would be convenient for them to start to charge. And that way we can build our charging into our daily activities in the same way that perhaps we do with our mobile phones today.
Good answer. Next question then. Who's next? Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I've got two questions. I'm going to do the one on housing first.
Can you do that one, then we go to the next?
And then we'll see, because when we get round to transport, I've got another one as well.
Yeah,
so on housing, we've got development control, and we can bring in supplementary controls, and we've got incentives. And one of the things that's quite clear now, because the public are probably going to have to pay for this, we've got to get the public on board to try and to reduce their carbon footprint as well. So what development control measures should we be taking? For example, should we be stopping the use of concrete in construction? Should we be making our standards very, very high? Should we compare them with other authorities in the combined authority to try and move up the grade? I don't accept the premise necessarily that tougher and better controls and compliance will discourage developers, because developers may want to develop in a county and an authority that is green and that is growing anyway, and Cambridgeshire is growing. So should we be doing things now, and can we, to stop gas boilers going into buildings, to retrofit, and all the other things that we need to do?
Yes, that's absolutely at the heart of our recommendations. Certainly on new buildings, it's very clear, government have made it clear at a high level, as indeed the Climate Change Committee have amplified, exactly what level of energy efficiency you need in new buildings to meet the net zero standard. It's certainly not rocket science. We just haven't got the full decarbonisation of the grid yet. So we just need to adopt that future home standard as soon as we can. And because of the high levels of growth in the area, that's why we've said go sooner. But on your point about embodied energy, which is obviously once you've nailed the amount of energy you're using on a daily or annual basis in any building, then it's actually the emissions from the construction materials that becomes key. And there's nothing in regulation at the moment, but there are many clients and some local authorities who are now setting what we call embodied carbon targets, and I would really encourage you to do that, and that is one of our recommendations, that the combined authority looks into the idea of setting early stage targets. I mean, not necessarily the most stringent of targets at this stage, but because there's nothing in regulation to really direct development towards thinking about lower carbon materials, reducing things like cement in particular, which is a high carbon material, and that way you're going to get a whole package of low carbon for new homes. On the existing stock, as I said, I think it's very clear now. There are a number of reports about to come out which will reflect in our final report exactly what targets we should be trying to aim for in terms of energy efficiency in existing homes to make them ready to get rid of gas boilers, because making no bones about it, if most older housing, if you just slam a heat pump in and go electric, it's going to cost the occupier more. So you have to do a certain amount of energy efficiency to make that work properly. And that's the idea of having a plan and having a local demonstration program that really encourages people to become familiar with the idea of what's needed for decarbonisation and feel much more confident with the local supply chain in doing it.
Excellent, thank you. Councillor Day, I'll come back to you.
Supplementary on that.
Oh, sorry, yes, please.
Yeah,
sorry.
Just specifically on, thank you for explaining how in construction it's important to reduce that carbon footprint as well. In Peterborough, we happen to have an awful lot of development being talked about at the moment, and the council indeed has borrowed, will make finance available to do some developments, joint venture companies here and there, whatever, from Northminster to North Westgate to the South Bank, and they're also talking about new swimming pools, etc., etc. But a bulk of this will be housing. Planning applications haven't been submitted yet, and I'm a bit worried that applications could be submitted before we've taken the necessary steps to ensure that we're getting what's appropriate for this day and age. And once people have got planning permission, they could sit on it for a long time before they actually build. So what I'm wondering is what can we do to say to anybody now who's developing in Peterborough, whether it's a housing cooperative, a housing association, I'm sure they've got high standards at the moment anyway, but particularly the speculative private developers and partnerships we've entered into, to make them do even more than they're probably minded to do.
Well, I happen to be also a chair of the quality panel in Cambridge, so we're seeing on a regular basis developers coming forward who've made, very, very high level commitments on climate change, but the reality of their submissions, leaves much to be desired. And what we can say, although they're saying they're building to building regulations now, is that the government have said that local authorities can set their own standards for the time being in relation to this specific point on future home standards, and that in 5 years' time, this standard will be what the public expect. So, any developer that's flogging today's version, which actually is 10 years out of date in terms of regulation, is potentially shooting themselves in the foot, you might say. So we're just pointing up the fact that the future is writ large in front of us, as what one of the councillors said earlier. We know we're in a rush here to get, to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And therefore, we're asking the question. It will become the norm very quickly. So we are sticking our necks out and saying, the combined authority should be just laying it on the line and saying, why build something that's already obsolete?
Councillor Day.
Thank you, Chair. On page 15 of the report, it says that all new builds must have access to green space and nature. Kind of linked to Councillor Murphy's question, we are building far more homes and residential spaces in the city centre. And given these recommendations, should we be considering developing on one of our own largest open green spaces in the city centre?
I think that's probably one for me. Again, I don't think we can comment on the specifics of that without obviously your officers and you as councillors will take the view on the appropriateness. I think what we can say is the Commission have identified the co-benefits of green space. So it's not just the appreciation of the green space. There's health benefits, and COVID's really identified that. So we would be expecting, as part of new developments and existing developments, that attention is paid to the access to good quality green space. And certainly we are starting to talk about the forthcoming changes to the planning system, which is going to mandate an increase in biodiversity from development on a very sort of systemised metric that everyone will be able to understand whether there has been an uplift. So there are opportunities from development to actually increase the quality and the biodiversity and public access to green space through that. So obviously that's the approach that the Commission is recommending. They also highlighted the urban cooling effect of appropriate greenery in urban areas, and I know obviously Peter is blessed with large amounts of that through the new towns design, but that's certainly something, again, which as climate change increases our average temperatures is going to be important. So I think the principle is certainly that appropriate provision needs to be made.
Can I bring in Steve Cox at this point? He's got his hand up. Steve?
Thanks very much, Chair. Just a couple of points. One really just to come to Councillor Day's point about the embankment, which I think is what Councillor Day was referring to. We, of course, have got plans for a master plan to be prepared, which at its heart will be looking at the what's the overriding purpose to the embankment. How can we make it a place that people would want to go to and enjoy the green space down there? And that would be the starting point for that piece of work. And picking up what the Commissioner has just been saying, the other point I was going to mention is around the climate change action plan that we're preparing for the council and working to prepare something similar for the city, where we've got an influence as the council on Councillor Murphy's points through our joint ventures. Then we should be leading by example where we can to influence the work of those organisations. And I think if we can embed and call on the climate change working group to look at how the climate change action plan that the council is going to bring forward is reflecting those priorities, then we can then influence the organisations that we are in joint ventures with. So I think there's a really important role for the working group. And just a couple of other very quick points, if I may, on the EV charging points. I think although we need the network to grow substantially, as Greg was saying, I think Peterborough does have more charging points available than most, if not all, other authorities in the east of England. And I would sort of urge the committee to be making the case for that infrastructure to grow sort of rapidly, so that any funding that is available comes into Peterborough to expand the network, to consolidate our position as having a strong starting point on EV charging points. And the final point was just around the local plan. It is nearly 2 years old. It is relatively new, but I think, as Adrian said, we do need to keep the evidence base under review. There are no plans to look at the local plan at the moment, but there are a number of issues that have changed in those 2 years. And Adrian was right to mention the planning reforms, which I think will give some guidance for how new local plans should be created. And as a footnote to that, there is some work taking place across the Oxford to Cambridge arc that is putting together a vision for a spatial framework, I should say, shortly for consultation. And I'm confident there'll be a strong environmental theme to that when it comes forward in the next few weeks for us to look at and comment on. I just wanted to share those points. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, Steve. Thanks for sharing those. Next question then, please. Councillor Joseph. Oh, I do apologise. Yep, Councillor, I've got you here. Oh, Councillor Fox, then Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. My question's regarding on page 57, and it's CPCA with relevant authorities to explore options to improve cycling infrastructure both within urban areas and encourage the use of e-bikes, longer trips to and from market towns and cities. This is cycling from rural areas also. I'd like to make it a safer route for them to travel, because certain areas of the Green Wheel, for example, are in need of attention. So a lot of the places, I think the need to sort of be able to cycle from rural areas as well to help with the climate change is important. And I think you need to make it so that it's safer for people to travel to where they want to go on that route. Thank you.
Okay. I think that was more of a comment, unless you've got anything to come back on. Anybody want to say anything about that? Are you happy? No?
Just to say, the Combined Authority is Strategic Transport Authority with responsibility for the local transport plan, and we are looking to refresh that in the light of the Climate Change Commission's recommendations, which obviously stressed active travel and cycling. So I guess watch this space in terms of the overall strategic work. Obviously the Highways Authority deal in more detail on the individual routes.
Okay, thank you.
What I can add is that there's a very high proportion of the overall transport emissions which come from trips between about 5 and around 25 to 50 miles. And for the shorter part of that group of trips, so between 5 and 15 miles, those are very well suited to e-bikes, even though they may be a bit long for a conventional cycle. And so if good cycling and safe provision can be made for those types of trips, we can make really quite a significant impact on the CO2 emissions by encouraging those people to start to make use of e-bikes. And there has been some very good work done by an organisation called CREDS at Leeds University to actually highlight the opportunities which specifically come from e-bikes to make these slightly longer trips that bikes are not usually considered for.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that. Councillor Joseph, and then I'm going over this side.
Thank you, Chair. I was just sticking on housing at the moment. So obviously we have had many conversations with finance officers in regards to plans to build council houses in Peterborough now that we've got a housing revenue fund. And part and parcel of those conversations was around about obviously building sustainable and carbon neutral homes, such as the Goldsmith project in Norwich and places like that. We were told due to the land, that the small amounts of land that were available now, that those sort of projects are perhaps not going to be cost effective. So how are we going to push forward the building of council homes and indeed other homes if we're not prepared to stick to the sort of deadlines and criteria that are going to make these houses carbon neutral?
Anyone want to answer that one?
Could I just say what a fantastic example the Goldsmith Street is? We had, I'm a judge on the National Housing Design Awards, and we had the Housing Minister up on the stage saying how wonderful it was 2 years ago, and it's been done at a decent budget, and it's, in fact, we've used one of the illustrations from my visit in the Commission report. But it's a fantastic example of building something that's really resilient for future change. It's really, A, it's a nice place, B, it's it's got a good microclimate, it's got good planting, so it won't overheat, it's got little sunshades and things, but essentially it's built to last. And I think certainly as chair of Good Homes Alliance, which is one of the things I do alongside the Commission, is with 20 or so local authorities all wanting to build, and they want to build for the future. They want to build resilient homes that are going to be a good long-term investment proposition. And both private investors and local authorities who are basically asset managers for the future, don't want to be building something that needs retrofitting in the 20 years' time.
Yep, Steve, you want to come in again?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was just going to say that the housing revenue account business plan will be going to Cabinet in the autumn, and the opportunity that gives us is, as we develop out and up our new stock of housing that is controlled by the council, we have the opportunity to apply the zero carbon principles, because we have a target to achieve net zero carbon by 2030. And again, I come back to the climate change action plan that we should be putting together to help guide decisions on the HRA, as well as other decisions that the council will take in the coming months and years.
Good, thank you. Okay, we'll go to this side for a little while. Councillor Sainsbury, you've got a question?
Thank you, Chair. I'd be interested to know what thought has gone into the report by the Commission as to how young people could be engaged with the recommendations.
Adrian.
Thank you for that question. And it's something that came up during the first phase of the Commission's work. We do have a younger commissioner, I don't know if that's the appropriate way to say it, but in terms of trying to sort of have that perspective. But what the Commission is doing for the second phase is actually looking to have a series of engagement events across a broad spectrum of residents to get views. We also, as part of the Commission's report, there's a chapter which is very much aimed at what people can do themselves, because obviously behavioural change is going to be a very big aspect of this. But we're looking that the Commission will make some recommendations on engagement as part of its second phase in particular, just to make sure that it goes along with the just transition and the fair transition, that both the views are coming in on the impacts, but also people understand what action they can take. So I think it was recognised. There's certainly more we can do, and there is some work underway on that.
Thank you. Anybody else on this side? Councillor Sharp, please.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Just hold it. Sharp, did you want to come in?
It's not essential, don't worry. I was just going to add a brief comment just in addition to that, in terms of some work we're doing locally in regards to engagement with young people as well. So we are embarking shortly on a piece of work to engage secondary school pupils around the climate change agenda, working closely with some of our other partners on that. And the approach that we're developing and we'll be piloting with a few schools initially is a two-phased approach, which is very much about trying to work with young people to raise and improve their understanding of this agenda, but also working with key people within schools themselves to try and look at how we reduce emissions from schools and the operations that they undertake on a day-to-day basis. So trying to tie the two things together to make sure the young people can have an influence not only in their own school and their own setup, but also take that education home into the way they sort of live their lives effectively. So just an update really to provide, and we can provide more information, of course.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming in. Then Councillor Sharp, then, for your question.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so just to change the direction from that back to, well, it's point 9 on page 39 of the main report. So you talk about actively brokering and appropriately investing in the creation of decarbonisation projects, resilience of built environment, etc. Has the committee got any examples or any thoughts to good projects that have delivered that, and how we might take that forward, given that we've made initial attempts, but it's clearly a steep learning curve for an organisation such as ourselves.
So obviously there's in each of the topics there's a whole range of demonstration projects going on across the country. As we've heard, some of the work on the social housing, the Norwich scheme, but in terms of charging and other things, there's a whole range. So what the Command Authority is going to be doing, looking at its programme, is to where we can best add value and bring forward some demonstration projects. So obviously the current focus of the Command Authority is funding through the devolution deal, was particularly around transport. We did have an allocation for affordable housing, but very much that's sort of coming to the end of that allocation. So what we have recently done is to look at the zero emission buses programme that the government announced. We've got through to the second round. Unfortunately, the way they phrased the competition, Peterborough wasn't one of the locations we could put forward, but we're certainly looking for other opportunities to do that, to take forward those examples. We're also looking at opportunities that could arise from the new approach on biodiversity and how that might be organised to best effect across the Command Authority area. So I think at the moment we're reviewing where we can bring forward schemes to do that. We have worked with, the mention was made of e-bikes, and we've done work with e-bikes and e-scooters. So again, there's opportunities that we take as they come along. But certainly we're open to ideas as to what are useful projects that we could bring forward.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else down this side? Question? No. Councillor Murphy, back to you then.
So, as we've moved on to transport, it does seem that we've got quite a lot of resources in this report and within the combined authority and within the local authority. And I hope that those resources are ongoing to help Peterborough City Council improve and contribute to tackling the climate emergency. I don't know whether the Commission are carried on or engaged in that, but hopefully that will happen. But on transport, in the presentation we were told that it was 40% of pollution emissions and contribution in Cambridgeshire, but it's growing, and it's growing faster than almost anywhere else in Europe. So we need to do something about that. And I've noted that in Birmingham, they've decided they're going to reconfigure, well, this is what they say they're going to do, their transport network to stop people using cars because they could use bicycles and buses and other forms of transport. Is there any inkling that the new transport authority, because from April it actually effectively took over transport, will be working with the local authorities to do that in places like Peterborough, so we enhance the 40-year-old cycle network, we get the hierarchy correct, we put the pedestrian and the cyclist on the top and the motorist not so near the top as I think we unfortunately be doing in Peterborough. So are there any plans for us to do that?
So, as I've said, the Combined Authority is reviewing the local transport strategy, which sets overall strategic direction, and we'll be working very closely with the Council through the Combined Authority to do that. As part of that, we've commissioned some work on looking at alternative fueled vehicles. To answer some of the more detailed questions of how we accelerate the take-up of non-fossil fueled vehicles. And we are currently starting on the process of looking at bus reform. And so under the government strategy, we're now able to look more seriously at bus franchising or other models. And that's something the Combined Authority has started and will be looking to come back on later in the year in terms of where we've got to with that. So working with bus operators, but again with councils. So there is quite a significant body of work that's taking place over this year on that. Obviously, we're not involved in some of the more local investment into transport, but certainly at that level, we're looking to address some of those issues, and we've been working hard during the COVID pandemic to support the bus industry, and as we come out of that, again, we need to again make sure that that is supported given the declining usage that we've seen over that period.
Well, thank you.
I mean, sorry. Can I just add a few words? Lynn mentioned earlier that there is a new national heat strategy due imminently. It is imminent, I can assure you, it will be before parliamentary recess. There's similarly a national transport decarbonisation plan that will be coming out on the same day. What that is likely to do is to really set a new focus for transport in the UK, not only a shift to zero emission vehicles, but also I think putting much more responsibility onto local authorities in relation to being able to secure funding for local projects that encourage more sustainable transport, walking, cycling, public transport and the like, in order to discourage car use in towns and cities. Policy is changing really quickly in this area, and there will be new funds becoming available and new directions being given to local authorities. I think that will make very significant difference in the next year or two.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a supplementary?
Yeah, I do have a supplementary, and I'll make it quite quick. I think waiting on policy development from government is probably to be very cautious about, because I mean the jury's in. The government set targets, but they haven't said what we're going to do about it yet and who's going to pay for it. So I think we need to be setting our own targets and getting on with it. I know there have been some projects, a cycling roundabout in Cambridge and bits and pieces and a few hard things to encourage cycling, but we haven't had an inkling of a transformation of the road network like they're saying they're going to do in Birmingham. And I'm wondering whether I'm moving to a recommendation there that the Combined Authority does consider transforming the road network to bring about these changes.
Anybody want to comment from point of view? Or maybe it's going to be a recommendation and get some of the looks of it. Okay, I've got a couple more questions in time, so we'll go for Councillor Day again.
Thank you, Chair. On page 18, it says that the Combined Authority are looking to create a funded delivery team within the CPCA to coordinate, champion and facilitate action. I wanted to make sure that this is reflected at the local level here in Peterborough as well. We do have a Principal Climate Change Officer, but it's obvious we need to build and increase this team if we are to recommend this report. I just wondered if anybody could let me know what might happen on a more local level rather than just at the CPCA level so that we get the action needed here in Peterborough. Thank you.
Steve, is that you? Do you want to comment on that one? Or?
Chair, I think if I can just briefly to say that we have increased the resource that's available. I know it's from small beginnings, but it is important that we keep pace with the change in the significance and importance of the agenda. We will work with Adrian and the Combined Authority to see how much of that resource that will be provided to a team at the Combined Authority can be dedicated to Peterborough. And I think that's all about putting ourselves forward to take on opportunities that come from the action plan and demonstrate that we want to be ahead of the game. So we will work with the Combined Authority to see how we can get some resource into Peterborough to help us to drive forward our ambitions.
Thank you, Steve. You've got a supplementary? Yeah.
Well, it's not a supplementary, but I was going to move to a recommendation just to say I wanted to recommend this is to consider the capacity of Peterborough's Council to play its full part in developing and implementing an area-wide action plan with a view to making recommendations regarding officer skills and availability. So I was going to ask to move us to make sure that we can actually achieve these goals, as it's a huge task.
When we get to the end of the question.
Oh, right, okay.
I'll specifically ask for those to be repeated.
Thanks.
So we make a full note of those and make sure there's no dissent, and then if necessary that will become a recommendation. Yeah. Councillor Casey.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose it's a sort of winding up question, or it's a sort of overall question. It's about the relationship between this report and also COP26 later on, and what sort of initiatives are you hoping to come out of COP26 later on that will they have an impact on this? And as this is the initial report, when will the next report be coming? And sort of will it be shortly after COP26 or hopefully not before? But it would be interesting to get people's views on that. I know I went to the, well, I didn't go, it was virtual, but it was the COGX discussion at King's Cross earlier this year, and they were talking about the impact of AI on climate change initiatives going forward, and I'm just wondering because I did a word search for AI in the report and I couldn't find it, but what value do we hold of that based, bearing in mind we've got Cambridge University and we've got universities in the area that should be very sort of towards the top end of that sort of research. The other book I read recently was by James Lovelock, which was called Neoscene, and it was about his view, he was the person who came across the Gaia hypothesis about 50 years ago, and he was talking about how AI could help humanity find solutions at a faster pace than because it has increased brain or computing power. So what sort of approaches have we got towards that going forward, and AI finding the solutions?
Perhaps if I start off, and I'm sure the commissioners, I think you gave us an open goal there for a wish list of things that we want government to do, which we could probably spend all evening on. just on some of the practical bits, the Commission is looking at some new topics, and it does intend to report before COP26 because it's their initial view on those other topics, which we think is important for that. But what the Combined Authority asked the Commission to do was to make some recommendations on what are the ongoing structures that are needed to take forward this whole climate agenda, to keep it up to date. So that will be one of the things that we will respond to when we see what the Commission say about that going forward. And you mentioned some of the sort of technology, and we had as an example, we had one of our subgroups today on business, and they started to explore the sort of crossover between different sectors. So if you take the agricultural sector gaining from data sector, and that was one of the examples, given very much that there's a big move to precision application of fertilizers and drones, and there's a huge crossover, and whether we're in the right place as an area to do that. And so certainly from Peterborough's perspective, the 3D printing opportunities, the fact that we're supporting the university with a very much a zero carbon emphasis in terms of the sort of research that it's going to do and the spin outs. So there are some opportunities on that. I'm not really qualified to say about the AI aspect. We'll certainly feed that back into the business subgroup to see if they're picking that up.
Thank you very much. Good question. I've got one from Councillor Joseph. You've got a second, and then I'm going to ask. I've got two myself, and then I think we'll be out of time. Is that okay? Okay, Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and make it brief. Just to put it in context, I have been having regular fortnightly meetings with the Finance Director, so and many of these issues have come up because they were some of the ideas here were things we wanted to put forward as part of our manifesto. So, you know, being told that they perhaps weren't affordable now makes me wonder how come they are now affordable. In terms of the electric vehicles, one of the things we were looking for, obviously, is a new fleet for Peterborough City Council because the current one is coming to the end of its life. And the issue around having electric vehicles was that they weren't able to complete some of the rural routes. So I guess we have a chicken and egg situation here is if we can't buy electric vehicles because they can't service the routes. So when are we going to have charging points perhaps in some of the rural locations to allow that to happen? And also in terms of CO2 emissions, one of the big areas of concern is cars idling outside school when parents drop their children off. What schemes or plans have we got to put in place to perhaps prevent things like this happening? We have one scheme in our ward where the road is closed at school time, so only residents are allowed to enter the road to prevent cars pulling up and parking and idling outside the school. Are there any further plans for that sort of thing in Peterborough? Perhaps Steve could answer some of those questions.
I think you're right. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. I will perhaps defer to Charlotte on the active travel. I know there's some initiatives around schools that I think will be helpful to that. But the point is an important one about, you know, making sure we've got the charging network around the city so that we can confidently use electric vehicles across our fleet. We are making a start with the procurement of the new waste fleet, but we'll need to progressively increase the number that are charged and used as electric vehicles, and I think the commitment is there to do that. But we have to make sure that the fundamental purpose of those vehicles is to collect waste, and that happens, and we will do that. But making a start with some electric vehicles, but rolling that forward as we renew the fleet in years to come. I don't know whether Charlotte wants to pick up the point about schools.
Yeah, sure. And I'm really glad you've got a school streets project happening in your ward. They have proven really successful across the city in a number of schools so far. As councillors may be aware, the council received funding as part of the active travel funding from the government for a number of different measures that we could undertake to support more sustainable modes of transport. School streets was something that we offered to all schools across the city. Now, of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, all schools are not suitable for a school streets measure because some are on bus routes, for example, so it's not possible to close the road outside of the school. But from memory, I think we have 12 I'm going to say 8 to 12 projects active. I can circulate a list of them. And many of those schools are now wishing to put permanent traffic regulation orders in place to enable those schemes to go forward permanently. And they're managed by those staff in those schools that make sure they basically go out, close the road, at school drop-off time, open it up again once all the pupils are in, and then they do the same at the afternoon pickup, and it's working really, really well. So we are really pleased with the output of that. And again, if you've got any schools in your wards that are interested in doing this, it's not that we would stop now. Any schools that are interested in coming forward, we'll get our guys out there and do an assessment of the site, make sure they've got the staff in place that are willing to make this sustainable, and we'll get them up and running. So please do keep coming forward with schools that are interested. One of the other things I was just going to touch on, which is on a related subject, in fact, we've been looking at other forms of fuel as well in the short term, where, for example, electric isn't a viable option for some of our fleets. As you know, I'm responsible for the highway service, and as you can imagine, we have some very big vehicles that operate across the city's network, some of which there aren't suitable electric alternatives for at the moment. So we're exploring the use of an alternative fuel at the moment, a HVO fuel, which reduces emissions by about 90%. And in fact, Hannah was out on site today looking at a suitable location for a fuel storage tank to enable that to be held at our depot, so that we can convert the Milestone, formerly Skanska, fleet to HVO as a very short-term step before we can switch those vehicles to future modes, whether that be hydrogen, electric, what that needs to be at that point in time. So hopefully that's just more useful context for you.
Thank you very much. We're nearly out of time, but I'm going to try and get both of mine in, but certainly I'll get the first one in. I just want to bring this in from a different angle. If we think of what's happened with COVID, the fact that people couldn't travel, the fact they didn't, and shops were shut in the town, etc., drove them to online shopping. I think we all know that, and that of course created then the big influx of courier vehicles, which are just massive now in all cities, and certainly in ours. You find them everywhere. The white vans are everywhere. How do you see it that, I mean, what's going to be taken into account that at the moment we seem to be going, yes, we know we've got a problem, we know we need to deal with it, but we need to bring people along with us. My concern is if we go too hard to stop vehicles going into a city centre, what that does to the centre from a point of view, or does it just send them all online shopping, those that, want to come in but can't come in? I'm just thinking, how do you work with business to know that, what can you do in order to sustain them? We don't want to kill businesses, but of course we want to go more green. But it's a question that's got to be answered, that you can't just, I know there'll be other public transport, but people won't take it, that some won't, some are in denial, and that's the way we have to try and convince them. But what about business? How are we working with business to sort of to encourage people to come in a more greener way, rather than not come in and go via online? Is there some sort of conversation going on down that line?
So Greg might want to come in on this, but certainly I think that a number of places have explored different ways of encouraging this, and I think it is always you need good alternatives. So it's not just the classic stick. It needs to be actual proper provision as alternatives that can be delivered. I think what we're going to be doing as the Combined Authority is seeing how much behaviours have changed and embedded. So are we still going to be buying things online at the extent we have? Are people still going to be working from home where they have had the opportunity to work from home in the similar numbers, which might change how businesses see city centres or other locations? It may be that other businesses will expand. It might be that some of the leisure and cultural activities will expand as a sort of result of a different environment. So I think it's something that would need to be considered as a whole package, a holistic approach, and that's certainly what those other cities that have taken that approach, they've spent a lot of work building up that evidence and working out how it can be encouraged in that positive way. I mean, there will always be, as you say, some winners and some losers, and the opportunities to minimise the adverse impacts.
Okay, thank you. And my last bit, if I may just put this one in, is we've heard a lot in your report, we've read a lot in the report, we've heard things on the news, etc. But what could we do now? Where's the low-hanging fruit in this? What can we do now? Can we, could we get a budget fairly quickly to buy trees, for instance? Something quite simple that if the land was available, we could very quickly create some sort of carbon absorption very quickly rather than waiting, which we are looking at, reducing cars, etc. But what can we do to absorb it quicker to help ourselves along the way? In other words, is there something that we can tap into to get some sort of funding to start the absorption side of it now? And then obviously as we work on getting more electric vehicles, fine, they come in. But that's not going to happen overnight, as we agree. But trees could happen fairly quickly if the funding was there and the land was there.
I'll start, but I think I might still Lynn Sunder, but one of the sort of biggest impacts on the building stock is insulation and bringing the worst buildings up, and it's incredibly cost effective, making sure loft insulation is a sufficient depth, or you actually have it, and so that's part of the sort of usage of the green sort of grants that government has been pushing out, that's now more directed to local authorities distributing. So that addressing the housing stock is something that would have a really cost-effective impact. And the sort of greening aspect is important, but obviously they also take time to grow. They're absorbing carbon as they do, but there is a sort of a time period as well as they get more established. And we've sort of heard on some of the transport side is encouraging that behaviour change approach, because we do actually have public transport that people can use more, and that's certainly something we can look to leverage at this stage. In a wider context, we're also looking at the idea of habitat banks, where we're encouraging landowners to increase the biodiversity of their site, which could serve two purposes, nature and climate. And we're looking at whether there's some opportunities, and we've seen some market interest in that, because they're getting ready for the emerging market that's going to come from developers looking to satisfy their net gain objectives. So there's some things there. The University of Leeds work sort of costed different measures, and we can certainly make sure that that's available in terms of that data, and that's something that we're going to be looking at splitting down to a local authority level as well, which will give more things that are cost effective in the short term.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you everybody for your questions. I'm going to go to stop the questions there because we're at time, and I'm going to go for recommendations. So just to repeat the recommendations, if I could go to Councillor Day, you had one, I believe.
Yeah, I've actually got a couple, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the first one is about, with the world of grant funding, working with partners, understanding and providing leadership to all council departments was intensive. So are we able to do this? And we as a committee must consider this. So the recommendation is worded as follows: to consider the capacity of Peterborough Council to play its full part in developing and implementing an area-wide action plan with a view to making recommendations regarding officer skills and availability.
Okay.
So that slower.
It's slower, yeah.
To consider the capacity of Peterborough Council to play its full part in developing and implementing an area-wide action plan with a view to making recommendations regarding officer skills and availability. Did you get it? With a view to making recommendations regarding officer skills and availability.
Okay. Everybody, before I go to the next one, is everybody happy with that? No, there's no... Yeah, I just need a seconder then on that, please. Anybody want to second that? Councillor Joseph? We are obviously all in favour, so we're happy with that.
Okay, and then just a bit of background for this second one. So the main report does draw attention to the inevitability of impact of on our communities, but it doesn't really come across strongly in looking to the planning exercise. To address the inevitable impacts we are both looking at, we want to just put our council services on the right footing by addressing climate change. So the second recommendation is, alongside a carbon management action plan, the city will need a climate emergency resilience and adaptation plan which considers in detail and addresses the impact climate change will have on our communities. Shall I read that again? Alongside a carbon management plan, the city will need a climate emergency resilience and adaptation plan which considers in detail and addresses the impact climate changes will have on our communities.
Fine, yeah, good. Seconder?
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Murphy, seconded?
I'd like to make a comment on that, if I could, Councillor Day. Communities, because I think within this whole aspect, we need to look at who's going to have to pay. And I think it should be second nature, but within that, can we incorporate ensuring the poor don't pay too much? I think that would be really helpful in all this work that we're doing.
So after changes we will have in our community is ensuring our vulnerable communities are protected? Or
You got the gist, yeah.
Yeah.
Are you happy with that? Did you get that? Do you want to clarify?
Yeah, could you just clarify where that bit is going to be inserted, please?
So at the end, and addresses the impact climate changes will have on our communities and considers the impact on our vulnerable communities or most vulnerable communities.
Good. Seconder for that? Councillor
Thanks,
Murphy, any problem? All happy, agreed? Yeah, that's an agreed one then. I think, Councillor Murphy, you were going to put one forward or not?
So I've got a few recommendations. It isn't a very, very long list. I'll put them out there slowly and we can consider how we should do them. One of the things I'd like us to do, this report we had today, the March report, not only did it focus on transport and housing, it focused on nature as well, and we haven't had a lot of talk about that, but peat in Peterborough, all those things, open spaces, encouraging wetlands. Can we ensure that we engage with our tenant farmers and partner landowners early on? I'm bearing in mind the solar panel fiasco where we didn't talk to the tenant farmers about what our plans were. Let's get them on board because I think they're doing some of this anyway. So that's one, our county farmers estate officer to engage with them and find out their views.
Sorry, Councillor Murphy, could I just clarify views on which subject?
On the recommendations in the report and the actions this council will be taking. If you look in the report, in the executive, it talks about encouraging non-traditional use of agricultural land, bogs, peat, wetlands and all this and that. Those sort of aspects in there, it's quite clear.
That's fine, I've got that. Thank you.
You say you had another one?
Yeah, I've got some fairly specific forms. I would like for this local authority to engage with the combined authority about transforming the road network. I say that because over the last 4 years, the combined authority has reviewed buses. Okay, we had bankruptcies because of COVID, but we came up with franchising in the end, and we had plans for metros, etc., etc. I think if we just focus on transforming the road network, that would help.
If that's what you want to put as a recommendation, it's not a recommendation from all of us, it's your recommendation. So.
Yeah, it's a recommendation that should be looked at.
Can you just clarify exactly what it is for?
That work is undertaken to transfer the road network to tackle climate emergency.
Yeah, it's got that. Do you have a seconder on that one?
Okay. The other one is a specific...
Sorry, Councillor Miller's got to get a seconder on that one. Councillor Joseph, any dissent on that? Happy? Again, we're looking at it, we're not making this. These are just recommendations to look. Yeah.
This is more of a project type, a little recommendation rather than the big one. I'd like us to recommend to Cabinet that they review any moves that will discourage the use of brown bins in Peterborough. There's been a lot of talk lately about an extra charge, so they could have a look at that and also do what Oxford have done if we can. I accept the point you made about new fuels, that's quite encouraging, but lease or buy an electric dust car or refit one like they've done.
Okay.
Just ask them to have a look at it.
Yeah, that's all in there. Right, can I have a seconder for that one? Councillor Day. Sorry. These are only recommendations. That's all. You'll have plenty of time to look at this and come back. So you don't have to answer right now. So it's not a question for you. So Right, and...
I've still got two little ones.
Yeah, there's still one I need to second on you, and that was which one?
Just the tenant farmer one, if there's a seconder
Farmer.
on that,
Can I
please.
get a seconder?
Thank you.
For the record. You've got one, have you? Oh, right, sorry, yeah. Okay, so carry on, please.
Yes, so I understand a lot of work has been done on getting baseline emissions worked out from what the council does. It's our buildings, it's our fleet, etc., etc. I would like us to use the appropriate tools. There's a new one that might not be appropriate. So you can get into a peer group of councils and see how you're doing. And we actually set targets to reduce these emissions. Now,
so I think what we're talking to at the moment is this group. So is that to investigate the feasibility of doing that?
Well, for example, I would ask that I'd ask that the council look at its baseline emissions on things like libraries, community centres, council buildings, yeah, and work out how we can reduce them and present some targets.
Sounds right. Seconder, Councillor Day.
We're already doing that on the climate change working group with the council.
Through you, Chair, a lot of effort has been put in by particular members on the climate change working group, and we need to work out how that is going to work with us on this. But I'm glad this report has come to us, because I think we may give that group a bit of a shake-up, and more focus. This is real stuff that we can do. So I think we need to say to the council, will you consider measuring and bringing in targets to reduce emissions?
Okay. Seconder for that. Need a seconder? Oh, I haven't got a seconder, so I'm going to have to go. I'm going to have to go to the vote then if there's no seconder.
No, if it's not seconded, it's not.
Oh, sorry.
Forward.
Sorry, I do apologise. If we haven't got a seconder, I can't even go to vote. So.
That's fine.
Okay, carry on. The next
yeah,
one,
I'm sure that will be picked up elsewhere. The other one is a more practical thing. So one of the things in the report as well is about engaging and getting the public to take part in all this and so on, and that's why it's great that it's strategic, and great that we've had it here today. So when we had the first meeting I had with Baroness on this report was in March, and in March we've had some community centres closed, and I think specifically Stafford Hall, which is by a community garden, which is by Cross Keys Hub, which is by two schools that one have pioneers for the environment in them. I'm asking that if Stafford Hall could be used as a hub to bring about engagement on the climate emergency within that part of Peterborough. And also perhaps the £1 million that was promised to refurbish it be looked at and it be reopened. The building's been closed since March, so I'm recommending that we look at that building. Can it be retrofitted? Can it be made an exemplary example to the public about how we go about doing these things in this new way even better?
Do you have a seconder on that? I'm afraid you didn't get that one either, so you have to put that as a separate question. If we won't go as a recommendation, you have to send it in just separately to the officers. Okay, right, we've gone through all that one, so that's the end of that particular item. Sorry, Councillor Joseph, did you have a recommendation? Oh, I do apologise, I didn't see your hand go up. Yes, when you're ready.
Just obviously, I know that gentleman over there was saying that they are going to be doing costings and bringing them forward. So my recommendation would be that we have the finance director here to look at the costings for these projects going forward, because it's an absolutely fantastic report and some amazing recommendations in here, which would be fantastic if they go forward. But we need to have assurances that we're going to be able to support our share of the funding.
Okay. Seconder. Councillor Murphy, any dissent on that? Happy for it to go ahead? Yeah. Okay, so are you happy with that? Have you got what you need? Good, so that's the end of the recommendation. So thank you very much, everybody, for the officers, members, obviously for all your questions, they're excellent. And the answers, thank you very much too for all the answers. Obviously we're going to move on to the next item. So those that are not needed for the next bit, if you want to leave, by all means do. It's been a long night. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the commissioners. I don't know if I said commissioners in that, but thank you. If they're still here with us. Have they all gone now? Steve, thank you. Are you staying with us? I can't hear him. Didn't get you, sorry. I hate to say, are you on mute?
I am. I will stay till the end.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Right, then we'll move on then to the final bits now, which is item 7, which is the review of the 2021 work programme for 21-22. David.
Thanks, Chair. This is an item that comes to each scrutiny committee at the start of each municipal year. Members are asked to consider items that came to the committee in the previous municipal year and decide if any further monitoring is required. Members are also asked to consider and approve the draft work programme as agreed at the annual work programming session, and that all can later be revised at group reps meetings. Members are also asked to note the recommendations monitoring report and make any comments on any further monitoring of those items that may be required. And members are also asked to note the terms of reference for this committee. Thank you.
Okay. Just to remind you, obviously, we're not trying to fill the programme for the whole year because things will come up. So, you know, make sure we don't fill it to death. Otherwise, we won't give it enough time for things we really want to go on. So, if it's something burning, yes, but other than that, I would suggest we don't go fill it too hard. But anyway, anything burning that you want to bring in on any of that? No, none of those. So we move on then, please, David, to item 8, which is the forward plan of executive decisions.
Thanks, Chair. Standing item on scrutiny agendas, giving members the opportunity to consider any items on the forward plan relevant to this committee that they may wish to receive further information on or to bring forward to a future agenda. Thank you.
I'll give you a few minutes just to run through that if you've got them, just to have one through. Obviously, they have to be on our particular items. Okay, anybody got anything? Are we moving on? No, that's it. Okay, then it leaves me then to end the meeting and draw it to a close. Steve, could you pass back, and obviously anybody that speaks to the Commission, etc., the report was excellent, it was huge, it was great that it was summarised at the start and then in more detail further down. Excellent report, and we look forward to seeing that one again, the updated report in the future. Also, the things we need to do today, I've lost it now, where did I put it? Is, I'm just going to make sure we've covered everything. That was that we consider the recommendation set out in the initial report by Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Commission on Climate. I think we've done that. We recommend priorities for the Citywide Carbon Management Action Plan to the Climate Change Working Group. Yes, we've done that. And we agree to receive a briefing note on the draft final version of the final report from the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Commission on Climate. So you want that to come back, obviously. I'm sure we do. Okay, so we've covered all what we were tasked to do. So I'll bring it to an end. The next meeting is on the 4th of September 2021, by which time we'll be European champions. And anyway, like I say, excellent report. Please pass that back. Steve, if you would, please. Thank you again to everybody. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Thank you, members, officers, commissioners again. The support team, our member support team, and of course members of the public who've joined us, who are not watching the game. Thank you for coming along. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.